So good evening, everyone. Welcome to, my name is Simon Jacobson, for those that are here for the first time. And welcome you all. Just as a short introduction, one of the great challenges that plague Jewish life today, as well as religion in general, but particularly in the Jewish world, is obviously a profound maybe dissonance, or even worse than that, a certain profound inconsistency that many people identify as Jews, sometimes basically based on anti-Semitism or anti-anti-Semitism. And though it's a heritage that goes back thousands of years, yet very few find personal relevance in the Jewish faith, which of course explains why there's such a high rate of intermarriage and assimilation. Because when you're not finding personal relevance in a particular way of life, it's obvious it becomes optional. So I'm not here to bemoan the statistics, but all these things are really symptoms of an underlying problem. A few hundred years ago, Jewish people were essentially all living in oppressed situations. The only question of how oppressed. As a result, they were very strongly identified as Jews, even if they didn't like it. They had no choice, because they could not mingle and assimilate in the society around them. Specifically, of course, in Europe and in whether it's Central Europe or Eastern Europe or Western Europe, this was the reality. Things changed dramatically with the waves of emancipation that followed the Renaissance, and then what they call the Enlightenment. And over a short period of time, suddenly, for the first time in over almost 2,000 years, Jews were so-called allowed out of their ghettos and prisons, and as a result, were suddenly exposed to all kinds of new opportunities. And like with every new opportunity, always come new challenges. So in a strange way, when you develop mechanisms, defense mechanisms and tools to survive and to fight off any enemy, you sometimes are lacking tools how to deal with things when you're a free man. The Jews mastered the art of survival all the way back from times when they were in Egypt, and the same was under every empire following, whether it was the Persian Empire or the Greek Empire or the Byzantine or the Roman or the Byzantine or the Syrian Empire, not particularly in that order. So in every situation, Jews learned to survive, and not just to survive, but to thrive. And then when suddenly they were thrust in a relatively short period of time into newfound freedoms, freedom, like they say sometimes in business, failure is easier than success. You fail, you pick yourself up and try to rebuild. When you succeed and you don't have the right mechanisms and infrastructure, it can be very challenging. And this is exactly what happened to the Jews. The challenge was quite intense. Didn't know what to do with these newfound freedoms. Some argued, embrace them all, but then what do you do when they contradict so-called tradition? So I'm not going to go through a whole analysis of this, which I have done here in the class and probably written about it as well. But suffice it to say that we are here in the 21st century, product of the last few centuries. And what we see today, the identification with Israel and identification with a lot of our so-called enemies, that shaped so much of what the Jewish psyche is about. That's a whole different story when you have to deal with success. That story I mentioned several times here, the joke actually of the Jew that gets up in the Knesset and says that he has the solution to all our problems. Instead of fighting with the Arabs, what we should do is attack the United States of America, as ludicrous as it sounds, and of course they'll beat us, and then they'll rebuild us like they did Germany and Japan after World War II, and we'll turn into a superpower. But one old Jew gets up and says, but one small problem, he says, what happens if we win? You know? So, it's, in a sense, it's easier to plan for failure than for losing than for winning. And that is essentially really a dilemma, not only, I mean, for the Jews it's in a collective, global sense, but it's also individually. You know, I mentioned the statistic last week of, what was his name, the Major General Rickover, right? Hyman. Right, Hyman Rickover. So, yeah, so he was he's considered the father of the nuclear navy, the United States. He was a refugee, a Jewish refugee from Eastern Europe during the pogroms, came to the United States in the beginning of the 20th century, and rose in rank and became a 4-star general in the Navy. And you can say it loud, it's all right. People have embarrassed me more than once here. Sorry. I think actually they call him a general, if I recall correctly. Check up Wikipedia. But anyway, I stand corrected, fine. A 4-star admiral, so be it. So, and in the 1950s, he came out with was considered to be a historical type of statistic, a lecture that he delivered, where he compared the last century, meaning from 1850 to 1950, which is really the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, into the modern age. And obviously, when you think in terms of 1950 technology-wise, 1950 is infancy of what we consider today the technological computer information revolution. And the statistic that struck me was that is so powerful and fascinating, because it really puts in perspective history in a very powerful way. That in 1850, 96% of energy generated that people needed for their lives was generated by human beings or animals. And in 1950, 100 years later, 100 years, it changed completely, drastically, that 95% of energy is generated today through fossil fuels, not through humans and not through animals. Which essentially means that, technically speaking, that average human being in 1850 spent most of their day, most of their life, either in agricultural times, farming, or other type of hard labor to simply survive, to simply make ends meet, and so on. With the advent of fossil fuels, whether it's oil or gas or coal or all the different types of steam, as it was back then in the 19th century, this energy freed up a tremendous amount of time. So you have to ask yourself the question, psychologically, what did humans begin doing with this time? See, again, the challenge of freedom. So of course, the business answer is, now that we have so much time, and we have the machines, we can make a lot more money, which is true. In those 100 years, the increase, the exponential increase of generating revenue, went through the skies. Because now, you don't have to work 9 hours a day to produce a certain amount of energy. You can use a machine, or you can use, as I said, fossil fuels to do that work for you. Once upon a time, just a simple example, to light the street at night, you had to have a street lighter. You had to have someone going around doing the lighting. And at home you needed to do things there was no sort of automatic electricity and so on and so forth. So what happens to the free time? So the free time, to just use it to make money, what does that do for a human soul with so much free time? If suddenly, think of yourself, suddenly no longer have to go to work, you can just really sleep all day. Is that your situation? Yeah?
I just recently retired.
Okay.
And I'm terrified of retirement.
Good luck.
I understand what you're talking about.
Right. So, but imagine you no longer, and you don't have to worry about income. You get all your needs met. What would it do to a human being, the human spirit that needs to be productive and needs to feel accomplished? So no one should necessarily have to struggle more than necessary, but at the same time, freedom, in other words, is not such a simple word. I know we all dream of the idea of not needing to answer to anyone, not needing to work for anyone, not need to satisfy any people, and just be free of all these responsibilities. But what would you do with this freedom? And it's interesting, this is exactly the dilemma that faced Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They frankly screwed it up because of their freedom. Because they were living in the Garden of Eden, and all their needs were met. It said that they did not have to work for a living. Their major focus was going to be spiritual growth. Somewhat like in the later generations, you find the Greeks who considered work, and the Romans as well earlier, work to be a curse, which is really, in the Torah, you could call work a curse. It's the curse that God says to Adam, because you ate from the tree of knowledge, b'zeis apecha techel lechem, from the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread. Which means from now on, you have to start working for you. Had they not eaten from the tree of knowledge, their main function, their main role would have been, not that they would have been sitting around and just vacationing, they would be exerting themselves, but not exerting yourself to deal with overcoming pain, or trying to make ends meet, or overcoming anxiety, but it would have been toward growth, spiritual and personal growth. And because they misunderstood, or without getting into all analysis of what exactly happened there, bottom line is that they misunderstood or they misused their opportunity. Now most of your time is going to be preoccupied with dealing with the pains of life. Eve with the pains of birth and childbearing, Adam with the pains of making a living. Today, even if women are also working and so on, but bottom line is now you have to start struggling. And most of your day is not preoccupied with the ends of your life, but with the means. Which means that focusing on the transcendental needs of a human being, looking for a higher purpose, seeking our mission in life, is something that we have to struggle to find time for. Because most of the time we're busy with surviving. And when you throw into the pot all the anxieties and the psychological fears and concerns and the forces that have shaped us since we're young children, clearly we have plenty of demons and ghosts to contend with. And this is what preoccupies most people's times and lives. It would be quite probably not very comfortable for any of us to really know, if you were to wonder how much of your hard drive, your mind, your heart, your time is occupied with fighting fears, insecurities, fighting the different psychological challenges that we have. And how much time do you have to just focus on bringing light into your life? How much is about fighting darkness, how much is about bringing light? So it's not a question that anyone really wants to, let's put it this way, get a full, complete answer, because it may not be very encouraging. But nevertheless, whatever the statistic or whatever the number may be, clearly we spend a lot of time in fighting battles and fighting demons. And whether they are self-created, self-made, whether they're real, whether they're not real. But the bottom line is that there's plenty of them. And the focus and, in a sense, the goal of a class like this is to address this issue and try to come away with tools, and also know that.
I was closing it. Good. Listening to that. Sorry.
And I thought you all want to demonstrate what we do with freedom and with gadgets, that's a demonstration of the topic I'm addressing. So, and above all, to recognize that this is not a struggle that began today or in this century. It's a struggle that began from the beginning of time. So interestingly, even though it's sometimes sad to read the story of Adam and Eve and the fall and how they basically brought upon themselves the beginning of what we call existential loneliness, existential challenges. But on the other hand, the fact is that it began so long ago, teaches us and tells us that we're all in the same boat. Now that does not mean that misery loves company. It means that people have struggled with this issue and found answers. And in that sense, the Torah and Judaism has much to say about these issues. And even the fact that we talk about it, and we are not afraid to take the bull by the horns and address it head on, instead of avoiding it or, as I said, being so preoccupied by survival that you don't even have time to think about it, that itself is empowering. Because as the line goes, anything that doesn't kill us makes us stronger. So that is a general introduction to, in a sense, what this, I don't know if I would like to call this a class or a gathering. It has its own unique history that I've shared here. This, all of you sitting here are a friend of a friend. This has never been advertised. Everyone here came here because a friend suggested it. And it began back, if you would like to know, in not 1850, not 1950, but around 1981. Also pretty a lifetime. And there was a gentleman who, a mutual friend introduced me to someone who was looking for some spiritual inspiration. At the time I was a student, and I was also working in the writing of the Rebbe, the Bavitcher Rebbe's talks, as some of you may know. The job I did was remember hours and hours of these talks that were delivered on Shabbos and holidays when there were no notes taken and no tape recorders, so we had to retain it all. So I wasn't really involved. I was involved basically in academic work, a lot of writing and research, and we call behind closed library walls. But this fellow said, this guy's looking for some inspiration. He was a businessman here in New York. So I met him. He brought a friend along with him. And that was the beginning, the genesis of that no one at the time would know what would come of it. And these two guys brought another friend the next week, and we hit it off, so to speak. And it wasn't even a formal type of get-together. It was not even an agenda. Every week we just begin and say, okay, what's on your mind? And we start getting into discussion about all the issues, big life issues. And sometimes these discussions would go on maybe 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning. No one had day jobs, so it was like that. Or even if you... And it was fascinating precisely because there was no agenda, and we were people coming from so many different backgrounds. I grew up in a traditional Jewish home, and most of the people I met were not at all traditional, but we shared, obviously, the certain issues that the entire human condition discusses, which is issues of love and dealing with pain, and we all cry over things, and we all have our needs. And when you talk about the real fundamental elements that define a human being, the human psyche, we're much more similar than our cultural differences. Let's put it this way. It's only that our languages and our cultures and our traditions and separate us. But when you get into the issues of the soul, the heart, issues of, as I said, love, dealing with anxiety, and so on, that's a universal issue. No, there's no person on earth that is immune. We all have our particular needs. So this grew into a very fascinating discussion. I must say, I would not be the person I am today had these classes not continued on. And you're all here in one unbroken chain from that. It's really what it comes down to. And it just continued, and here we are. Who knows how many people? My estimate is probably around 35,000, 40,000 people over the 30 years. And I'm not going to go through my entire resume here. I just wanted to make the point that when you allow yourself to get beyond the minutia and the temporary, the impermanent details of our lives, and allow yourself to engage with others that are not like you, and talk about things that transcend our differences, unbelievable things can come out of that. But as I discussed last week, we are enslaved to our comfort zones. And our comfort zones are our greatest enemy, precisely because they make us comfortable. Which is the same problem as I mentioned about freedom. Precisely because you have all the choices before you, that's what makes it so difficult. Because how did you crystallize? How do you get a crystal clear type of focus of what you should be doing when you have all the options? When you don't have any options, you have to make do with what you have, and you figure it out. When you have all the options, in a strange way, it becomes more complicated, more difficult. And then we get trapped in what is called the inertia of indulgence, of freedom, of being able to do anything you want, and you end up not doing anything, really, because you have all these options. So how do you generate almost like a sense of crisis, or I would call a sense of urgency, in times when there's no war, and there's no battle, and there's no enemy fighting you? Because if you don't have a sense of urgency, what drives you? So for most of us, our sense of urgency is usually, as I said before, is about the minutiae. It's about survival. In the morning I wake up, I got to get to work, I'm driven to make some money, I want to make some more money, I have goals, etc., etc. Then of course we also have the sense of urgency that affects all of us, is when we need to find a companion in life. But that gets very complicated as well, because we live in a world where, if you don't have a good sense of yourself and your own soul, how exactly are you going to find a soulmate? So we then look to another to maybe solve our problems. That person will maybe find the savior. And if I find the right person, that will solve all my issues. And we all know, when you think about it, that no, you can't solve problems just with one panacea, one person you're going to meet, and everything's going to go away. So that's the bad news, so to speak. The good news is that we have before us, we have a blueprint, and we have a history, and we have people precedent. We have people who struggled with this and came up with answers. And on the chapters that we read in the Torah now, we have the story of Abraham. Abraham is the pioneer of them all. We call him the father of monotheism. The Torah calls him the father of all nations. And even on a genetic context, Abraham bore two children. He had Yishmael, who would later become the progenitor, the forefather and ancestor of the Arab Muslim world. He had another son, Isaac, who became the father of the Jewish world. Isaac had in turn also two sons, and one is Esau, who would become the ancestor of the Western Roman world. And Esau had a grandson, his name was Magdiel, who is in Hebrew is Rome, as Rashi says in a later chapter. So Abraham wasn't just a pioneer and an innovator, the context of a thinker, philosopher and seeker, and one who found God in a pagan world, but he actually gave birth to people, to children, and passed on to them a legacy, like it says in this week's chapter. He passed on the legacy of justice, tzedakah and mishpat, charity and justice, which was an innovation in its time. Even today, most people naturally are basically narcissistic, so charity and justice doesn't come naturally to us. But today, you can say that over the thousands of years, it's become institutionalized. Just when you see, for example, the efforts to rescue efforts when the earthquake last year in Haiti, or other humanitarian efforts. Well, even if it's for ulterior motives, but this is unprecedented. In history, when a country suffered a natural disaster, the first thing that all the neighbors did was pillage it and rape the country and its people of all their resources. Nobody went to spend resources. Why spend resources in a country that's not yours? So you see that things have changed in the standards of what we expect of ourselves and of others. But Abraham was an original because nobody did it then. Then it was completely unique. And even, as I said, after Abraham, it's just 300 years that we have the concepts of the Bill of Rights, human rights. Before that, we live in a world where monarchs, church leaders, religious leaders ruled with total authority. And nobody could challenge it. There was no such thing as a due process. And if you were lucky, we had a benevolent despot and so on. If you weren't, too bad. That's the world till 300 years ago. Again, we take for granted. But Chow En-lai said to the Western journalists when they asked him, when China opened up in 1971, they asked him, what did you think about the American and French revolutions? So he said, it's too early to tell. Because it's only 300 years. It's only 250 years. And but Abraham, if you think about it in context of history, a man almost 4,000 years ago spoke about tzedakah and mishpat, about rights, about the responsibilities we have for each other. This is unheard of. As I said, it did not become an institution. There was no nation except the Jewish people that followed that. It took time till this became a given. Today, it is a given. With the fall of the Soviet Union, with other countries, I think there's this Freedom Watch, what they call Freedom something, not Watch, Freedom. They gauge the countries of the world, how many are total dictatorships, how many democracies, how many freedoms, and it's changed. There's statistics that show that I think it's down to like 5 or 6 nations in the world that are still backward in the sense of complete authority of one person, no respect for any rights. Maybe a little more than that. I don't know the exact numbers. But it's a dramatic difference than it was, as I said, several hundred years ago. So we live in a new world, but Abraham nobody was like Abraham because he was the first. And the first to stand up and stick to it is unbelievable. And I'll just point out how tremendous a person like Abraham was. I'll just, by contrast, let's just compare it to some other greats. Now, nobody doubts that Aristotle was maybe the greatest philosopher in history. You have Plato, Socrates, the whole Greek. Then you have the Eastern philosophers. And you have every country produced its wise men and women, its wizards. And many left great marks, no question about it. That shaped history. But here's the thing that always struck me. No one, not one of them, left a family that perpetuated their legacy. Aristotle, did he have children? We don't even know if he had children. Grandchildren. Today, to think of someone to be a great-grandchild of Aristotle and following Aristotle's footsteps, the whole thing is, it doesn't exist. So they were great minds and academic giants, but it did not create a family. It did not create a community. It created ideas, and those ideas have shaped society. So you have a man like Abraham, who was by no slouch, comparatively speaking, quite a brilliant philosopher himself, a thinker. Not only that, he paid a price for his independent thinking, because he was the ultimate nonconformist, which is just another interesting irony, how religion became conformist when the father of it all was the biggest nonconformist. Meaning that he defied his whole generation, his own family. Lech lecha ma'artzecha, malad lecha beis avicha. But the key thing is that he didn't just teach a philosophy, he built a family around it. And that's why even God is in awe of that. In this week's chapter, God says, because of that, I cannot conceal my plans from Abraham, because he's a man that didn't just philosophize, he built a family around it. And the fascinating thing is, here we are, 3,800 years later, and we talk about that. Ben Avram, Yitzchak, V'Yankov, that you're a son or a daughter of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. And we know where they walked, we know where they're buried, we talk about them, we mention them in every prayer, I don't know how many times a day, in every Shemoneh Esrei, Elokei Avram, Yitzchak, V'Yankov, and we live by and we try to live by their ideals. So they didn't just build an idea, they built family, and they had family children who had children who had children. Besides the fact, the miracle, that the odds that Abraham who only had one child, Isaac, in addition to Ishmael, and that this Isaac would give birth to another child, and that the legacy would pass on, and that promise that the Bible says to Abraham that his children would spread like stars across the heavens. And that you have millions and millions of the Christian right in America who go by the verse in last week's chapter that those who bless the Jews will be blessed. I mean, think about the odds, how the odds of that happening. So I submit, the greatness of it is because in general philosophers, thinkers, creative people are not really domestic. Family is a nuisance for them. Everyone understands the beauty of children, and everyone would love to have love in their lives. But look at the study. Study the profiles of great thinkers and leaders. So on one hand, they had great geniuses, but they didn't have the discipline and maybe even the humility to diaper children. In a way, they said, listen, I don't have time for that. I'm busy philosophizing. I have great contributions to make. So the idea that a brilliant person, a mystic, philosopher, a thinker, should, at the same time, commit himself to take care of children and build a family with his wife is unprecedented. That can only come from someone that is not just a brilliant person, but someone who is a godly person. Someone who has ultimate humility and doesn't take his philosophy that seriously. And that was one of the most powerful elements of Abraham and all those that followed Abraham. It wasn't that they were just so brilliant. It was that the brilliance was not the end of it. That's just a tool. When you're smart, you have brilliance, it's like a tool chest. It was the humility to the cause that you have to create a community, you have to create a family, and create a nation. And you don't give up. Even though no one at the time was on Abraham's side, he forged ahead and believed that one day those ideas will take hold, and today they have taken hold in the entire world. So though of course there's differences and countries have different opinions, but certain basic principles that Abraham initiated have taken hold. That is, I submit, unprecedented. And that's why Abraham is one of maybe the greatest of all in that sense. So here we read his story, but in a strange way, as I said earlier, or maybe I alluded to, I grew up with these stories. Any of you that have read the story of Abraham, and you read every year you read the story again in the Torah, and you hear the Torah reading, and you learn it in school, and so on. At some point, it becomes almost mechanical, and you lose appreciation. That's why I specifically put it in context of history, and stepping back, and not just reading the verses, making it come alive in our own lives. Look at history. Look at the ideas that Abraham taught and what came out of it. So, and with this short or long, however you call it, theory of relativity, everything is short and long, introduction. So in those good old days when I was giving those classes that went on without any curfew, when we all wore clothing of younger people, I was known for my introductions. I would give long introductions, and I remember one of the guys in the class said, Sonny said, so when do we get beyond the introduction? Now this was 4 years after we've been studying together. So I recall that Arizal, the great mystic, maybe the greatest mystic of them all, the Arizal, the middle-aged 16th century mystic that lived in Sfat, Isaac Luria, Yitzchak Luria, the Ari, has obviously books of mysticism that he didn't write himself. He had a student, Chaim Vital, was the scribe of Arizal's teachings. Similar to the Zohar, just for the record, also Rab Shimon Bar Yochai didn't write it. He had Rab Abba, one of his prime students, wrote it. So there's a whole book called Shar Hagdamas, the Gate of Introductions. Okay, so the fact is really maybe everything in life is an introduction, and even the destination is an introduction to the next stage of life. So maybe it's a good way of looking at things that we never come to the end. In movies there's an end, the end. In life there's no end. It continues. And as I said, Abraham passed it on, and we continue and we pass on the legacy, like the baton in the marathon, from one generation to the next. But in that context, I do want to focus on one theme that we announced would be the topic tonight, and I don't just stick to introductions, to live up to deliver what you promise. So the topic being the theme of the opening verse of this week's chapter, and that is power of vision, of sight. So the opening verse, so we titled the class, is Seeing Believing. Now, the reality and the delusion of sight. So the connection is that when you open up this week's chapter, the first word, Vayeira, love, Hashem, B'alini Mamre, that Hashem, God, appeared to Abraham, in the plains of Mamre. And just to put things into basic historical context, technically what was going on is that Abraham, in the last chapter, had circumcised himself at God's command, and was of course in pain and healing. So he was sitting out in the plains in the sun, and God came to visit him, made an appearance. And the expression is Vayeira, he appeared to him, meaning that he saw him. There's expressions in the Torah you'll find Vayedaber, God spoke, Vayemer, God said. Different ways that you find God communicating to human beings, which we'll soon address. But here it's an appearance that has some element of vision in it, Vayeira. The word Ria in Hebrew, Ria, to see. Vayeira is appearing. And we actually derive from this appearance, from this visit, the mitzvah, a beautiful mitzvah of visiting the sick. Just as God visited Abraham, who was healing, we too learn from this that we visit those that need healing. If next verse, a few verses from now, this is not the theme tonight because I've discussed this in the past, is a second mitzvah which we derive from Abraham turning away from God and greeting the guests, greeting these strangers that were wandering in the wilderness, in the desert, and he greeted them and welcomed them into his tent, fed them. They ended up being angels, but he didn't know that at the time. So we learn from that the mitzvah of Achnasas Orchim. So there you go, two major mitzvahs, Bikkur Chelim, Achnasas Orchim, are derived from these first few verses. But the focus, as I said, I want to focus on is this word Vayeira, see. So first, just a short talk about introduction, just a short introduction about anthropomorphism. It took me many years to learn to pronounce that, like a tetragrammaton. These are hard words. Try it out, you'll see. But when you have years of experience pronouncing it, you learn to do so. So anthropomorphism, which is the concept of, essentially the Talmudic way of putting it is Dibra Torah b'lashon b'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in the language of a human being. So obviously anyone, even with a rudimentary understanding of spirituality and soul, understands that the words like God saw, God heard, God spoke, and so on, does not mean it in a literal sense, because we don't apply anthropomorphic principles to the divine. But they're essentially like metaphor. And in a fascinating way, when you study the Kabbalah and Hasidic thought on these matters, it teaches you actually to extrapolate and teaches you to strip ideas, concepts human concepts, from their human forms and understand we'll call it the archetype. So when you see someone see something, so yes, in our physical sense, you see something means you have healthy eyes. The eyes have the power to see. But when you start thinking about it, seeing is not such a simple matter. How do we actually see things? How does the eye work? And there are all kinds of theories that even till this day, science and medicine has not really figured out exactly. I mean, we know how it works, and we've replicated in a camera, and we've replicated and we understand. But the fact is, I look at you, you look at me, and you see an image. So yes, the eye has to have many facets and elements to make it work that way. There has to be a certain way of refracting light, etc., etc. But that's the mechanism. But what is actually happening when you see someone? And so when you talk about the idea of God appearing, what did Abraham actually see? What did God look like? If you ever saw the film Oh God with George Burns, right? So God, he says to John Denver that God doesn't take any form or shape, like he can't see me. Which of course is a basic principle. People say, oh, come on, I can't see. You also can't see love. You can't see anything that's really real. You can't see energy. So on one hand, seeing something doesn't mean anything. It just means that it has a external, superficial shape and form that you can relate to. But on the other hand, we can't dismiss sight as being so superficial as well, because the fact is, when you see something, it creates a certain reality in your mind. And take an example, looking at someone you love. There's something about seeing someone that you miss or someone that has power. So we can't just dismiss it and flippantly dismiss it as being some superficial thing, that if you really connect to someone, you don't have to see anything. We are sensory human beings, or sensual human beings, and we need our senses. Our senses are tools that help us interact with the world around us. As I mentioned many times here, if you really think about it, the senses are not needed for your own personal experience. No one needs eyes to see themselves, ears to hear yourself. You wake up in the morning, you don't need to look in the mirror to know you exist. Maybe some people do, but generally speaking, you don't really need to. If you do need to look in the mirror to know that you exist, there's some problems. So we don't need eyes, ears, taste, touch, and smell to experience ourselves. But there's no way for us to experience another without those senses. So the senses are really tools to interact. For me to hear you or see you, I need eyes, and you need ears to hear me, etc. So the senses are really bridges that connect us. If you were to close your eyes and your ears and your taste, touch, and smell, what would you be left with? You can try it out. You can try it out right now. Just keep your ears open so you'll hear what I'm going to say. So what will you be left with? You'll be left with, first initially you'd think like everything's going to disappear. Because we are constantly being stimulated, I would say overstimulated, by our senses. Especially in our day and age. I mean, statistics show by the time, in the Western world, the United States, by the time you're age 20, you've seen 1 million advertisements. 1 million. And it could be a lot more than that. How many messages did you hear today? By advertisers, by marketers, and not necessarily things you were invited or welcomed into your life. You walk down the street, we're hyperstimulated. If you want real hyperstimulation, take a trip to Times Square. And there you got it, the lights, the light and sound show. So it has a certain awesome element to it. So we are sensory creatures, but the interesting thing is, senses at the same time completely conceal who you really are. As I said, the real you doesn't even need senses. If you want to communicate who you are to someone else, you need to be able to have a sense. So what is this thing called senses in general, and particularly in this case we're talking about seeing? God appeared to Abraham. And what happened the day before? What kind of experience did Abraham have with God before he appeared? Because you find in the Torah, as I said, different experiences of the divine. Sometimes it's an appearance, sometimes it's a sound, sometimes it's a hint, sometimes it's invisible. As a matter of fact, the most part of times it's invisible. Can we see God? So the classical, so-called traditional response to that is no, we haven't earned our right, and God only appeared to these great people thousands of years ago. Which of course the cynic or the skeptic immediately asks, okay, well that's nice. If God is real, why doesn't God ever make an appearance today? So the real question is, if we were there with Abraham, would we even believe that God made an appearance then? If you're a cynic, you might as well be a cynic all the way around. What does it mean that God appeared to Abraham? What did he see? So they have in the Medrash, you say sometimes that God appears in this type of shape, in that form. For example, when the Jews left Egypt and they came to the Red Sea, so it says, the children recognized God first, because that was the God that helped them, save them, preserve them when there was the decree in the time of Pharaoh, wanted to kill all the Jewish males. So there's the Medrash describes the imagery that some people had. But is that really what God looks like, or is it what we create an image to identify with God? So I want to talk about that, and also in context of appearance. If God truly transcends the senses, then why do we have all these metaphors? Why should we even say God appeared, God spoke, and so on? It's an experience. Why are we using terms that can be so confusing on an entity that's beyond senses? So this forces us to go into, and this is always the best way to understand ideas, is not to try to abstract and philosophize, but to go into our own beings. There's an expression in the book of Job. It says, "Mipsari echzeh lekach," from my flesh I behold God, which, if you think about it, has a very profound meaning. On a basic level, you can say our flesh is created in the divine image, b'tselem Elokim, like the Torah says. So therefore, your flesh, in some ways, is a metaphor for godliness. But it goes even further than that. It means you are a microcosm of God's mind, because the way we are created, and that's what Einstein said. It says it's understanding God's mind. That's what science is. But even more specifically, science, you need to be a scientist. Be familiar with scientific ideas, with physics, quantum mechanics. But to look inside yourself is a little easier, because you are right near you. Does that make sense, right? You're pretty close to yourself. Actually, I should qualify it. Sometimes not so easy to look at yourself. But I mean to say, the easiest way, mipsari, from the flesh, look at your own personality and the way we function, and you can begin to perceive the divine. Because we are a microcosm of that divine picture. So let me go, let's take this a step further, this whole issue with the senses. On one hand, we are definitely live in a world of senses. As I said, we are constantly stimulated. We see things, we hear things, we taste things, we touch things, we smell things. Those are the five senses. That's how we interact. And they're very powerful and necessary. You walk down a street, there's all kinds of sights that you are taking in. In a different chapter, in the chapter in Sheftim, so the Siftei Kohen, the Shachan, the Torah says that Sheftim, they should appoint judges and police, law enforcers at all your gates. And he explains, Sharecha are the 7 gates, are the 5 senses that we have. In other words, that you have to be, as an adult, create a gatekeeper that doesn't just let anything go into your eyes, into your ears, and taste, touch, and smell. That's what healthy adults are like. They allow certain things in, certain things not. But the fact is, we are, as I said, completely inundated in a sensory world, and especially in our day and age, with the internet and with television and radio and sounds and sights constantly being transmitted all the time, thrown into the picture of cell phones and all the other ways of electronic transmissions of information. We're completely inundated. So as convenient as it is, it also is quite overwhelming. But then here's the fascinating contrast. Anything real in life is not sensory. As I said, love. Love you can express with your senses. You can kiss someone, you can hug someone, you can touch someone, you can look at someone. But love per se, the definition of love is not definable by the senses. If someone asks you, what is love? It would be as difficult to explain that to someone that doesn't know what it is as to explain colors to a blind person. Because it's not just the expression of love, as I said, has sensory expression. But the definition of the concept is one that is beyond senses. And this brings me to something I've mentioned many times here, which is when it comes to talking about superficial things, we can go on and on and on and talk and talk and talk. Just open up a radio and sports talk, sports radio, or some other gossip. They talk, it's endless. And people call in, and it's a whole thing. It's a whole industry. When it comes to talking about the things that matter most to you, you'll find very few words. It's not so easy to talk about. And I don't mean just painful things. Anything that's very intimate, anything that's very personal, anything that really matters. And that's not because your defenses are up and you don't want to communicate because you don't trust anyone. It's also because even if you did trust someone, it's not easy to talk about things that are very personal, very deep inside. So this is the paradox here. Why is that the case? It should seem easier to talk about yourself and superficial things like the weather. When the Weather Channel opened up, people said, no way that anyone's interested in 24-hour weather. You get a weather report and that's it. That's an interesting study in human nature. Weather Channel was a major success, continues to be. I have my theories that people just like whenever you see these the news shows, they always have a map and radars and stuff like that. Even though, as we all know, their predictions are usually not correct. But I don't mean the general prediction. Of course, if you follow the winds in Cleveland and they ultimately coming east, you know that New York is going to be that way soon. But I think it gives people a sense of control, thinking that they know the barometer, even though most people don't even know what a barometer is. And why would you need to know that the winds are from the southeast at 12 miles an hour or something like that? I mean, but they say this, Later, I came to discover, we know the temperature. Of course, it's hot and cold. Humidity is how much moisture there is in the air. But the barometer is the air pressure. And the truth is, the lower the barometer, the better you feel. Sometimes you can have a very nice day, but if the barometer is high, it's like your skin gets a little loose from your bones. No, really, that's the truth. It's not so much pressure. It's like the good feeling when you go underwater, for example. It's because the barometer there is lower. So obviously, too low is also not healthy. So that you didn't know that, right? So barometer actually is the real measure of knowing how you're going to feel that day. Is obviously a combination between. I know you didn't come here to hear a weather report, but I did a little research on this. But nevertheless, okay. But they talk about the weather on and on and on and on. Okay. So I understand if it's going to rain, you want to know, take out an umbrella. I can't resist the chelam joke that a guy goes outside with an umbrella and with his friend, and it suddenly starts raining. And he doesn't open his umbrella, so his friend says to him, why don't you open your umbrella? He says, because it has holes in it. So he says, so why'd you take it out with you? Why'd you take it? He says, I didn't think it was going to rain. This is a Chelam classic. So I know you got to think about like what the logic is. But we all do certain things like that. So when it comes to talking, however, about things that really matter, we have very few words. Why is that? And the answer is, which connects very much to the theme we're discussing here, is because words are containers. As we shall soon see, senses are containers. And a container, by definition, has parameters. So a big container can contain more things, more volume. Smaller container, less volume. But words are containers. So a container contains limited amount of data. So when it comes to superficial things, it's easy. It's not that intense. So you can have many containers and continue to talk about the most ridiculous stuff. When it comes to the intensity of deeper feelings, these containers are not sufficient. So that's why we humans have created a thing called metaphor. Some call it poetry. Some say that there is no such thing as poetry. It's like the emperor with no clothes, but everybody thinks it's sophisticated to appreciate poetry. Children, when I was a kid, I said, why don't they just say it straight? Why does he have to go around be so poetic about it? But then as you get older, they say there's a whole art to it. And the truth is, you can capture ideas that conventional prose and language can't. So metaphor. We use metaphor because the metaphor broadens the containers, and now more intensity can be expressed. And then, as you'll see, and this is a rule in Jewish mystical thought, in Kabbalah and Chassidus, which quantifies everything in terms of eres and kelim. Eres are energy, kelim are containers. Just to simplify, what that means is that everything in life has light, energy, and has a container. For example, you look at a book. The pages, the letters and the words on the pages, those are containers. The ideas conveyed through those words is the energy. So any type of communication is that way. You have a feeling, and then you find the words, the containers to express it. So you can have, for example, people, and this is like a common mistake that has hurt many children in school, where children sometimes, certain students are seen as being stupid because they don't communicate, because they're shy. Sometimes the most brilliant students are the ones that don't have that many containers. That never be misunderstood as being stupid. There are people who are very good communicators, they don't have a lot to communicate. So to really gauge or to sense measure someone, you have to not just look at what tools they have, you have to also look at what energy they have. So it's a good way to just generally look at a person. Sometimes you see a person and you could completely misunderstand. You'd think that they don't have anything to say. Maybe they just don't have the tools to say it. Maybe they don't have the courage to say it. Maybe they're shy. Maybe they don't feel comfortable. They don't trust the environment. And they have a lot inside of them. This is a very, as I said, a common mistake that people as superficial human beings that we can be, we measure things on externals. The expression, al tabet al mereyu. Don't look at the outer. Don't judge a book by its cover. But do you know anyone that doesn't? As an author, I can tell you they spend billions of dollars to produce covers, to design covers. So I don't know where this cliche came from exactly. Don't judge a book by its cover. Everybody judges a book by its cover. That's why they develop these covers, because they want to sell you the books. And packages make a big deal. Whether it's Apple products or others, packaging is major. I always love those exquisite packages, and then start unwrap, and it's a whole process just to unwrap it. They want it to be a process. And then you finally find what's inside of it could have been held in a small little thing, but it's the experience of packaging. Now, there's nothing wrong with packaging if there is what's inside the package is as valuable as the package. But we'll get to that soon. So basically, as we travel inward, and this is the rule, as I said, the rule in Jewish mysticism, the greater the energy, the less the containers. The more the containers, the less the energy. And an example given for this is the human body. I said, from the flesh we behold the divine. Let's look at the human body. Where is the greatest concentration of most of our faculties? It's in the head. And the head is the smallest part of the body. Now, every part of the body, of course, is necessary for health. But the head has the brain, obviously, the central nervous system, the spine, or the root of the spine. It has our eyes, our ears, our taste and touch, our mouths, and so on. So though the other parts of the body also have important faculties, but there's no such concentration. That's why the head releases more heat, for example, than any other part of the body. So more energy, less container. It takes up less space. You'd think the head should be the largest part of the body because it has so many faculties. But that's not how it works. Size does not matter when it comes to spirit and energy. And today, actually, a big part of technology is the idea of being able to capture or able to pack into a small transistor so much data, so much power. Because the more energy something has, the less space it has to contain. This was not the case. This was counterintuitive. 200 years ago, no one would ever say that. Because everyone would say then, the greatest nations are the biggest armies. The greatest enemies are the ones with the most firepower. That's not the case. The greatest, God forbid, diseases in the human body are the microscopic ones, not the ones you can see. One mutation of one cell among 75 trillion cells on the DNA level, on the cellular level, things that no human being can see. The same is true nuclear energy. Nothing is as powerful as nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is derived from elements, from microscopic subatomic particles that nobody can see. So it's actually, the more energy, the less container. So in that context, therefore, going back to the communication issue, the more intense a feeling, the less the container. So let's go back. I said like regular language is limited containers. That's why we can speak about superficial things, but the intensity of real feelings, you need wider containers. So we have metaphor, poetry, music. A song can communicate an idea, a feeling, much more than words can. Because a song is much broader containers. It's actually because it's not so rational. Words, are organized words. You construct an idea. You sing one song, and you could get a message over that would take volumes to be able to communicate. You may not be able to necessarily analyze what the song is message, but it'll resonate, it'll touch. The Alter Rebbe said, the author of the Tanya said once, when you ask a question, you don't have an answer, you tell a story. And if that doesn't work, you sing a song. So a story is more than a thought, and a song is more than a story. And what's the power of a story as opposed to why not just say the idea? Why do you have to tell it in a story? Because something about a story, the human connection, it reminds us of ourselves. It's hearing about people like ourselves. The reality of it, like a mice, it's a real event. It has some type of, as I said, expanded containers that you can convey an idea that you can't just convey in a philosophical thought. And a song is even greater and stronger than that. But then the journey continues deeper down the rabbit hole. And where does it go? There are expressions and feelings you can't even express in a song. So when you say, like example, oy vey, a real heartfelt oy vey, or just a cry, that can capture more than entire volumes. Because the intensity is so strong that you don't even have an expression except for that oy, or a positive expression. Like they tell that joke. They say that the guy was in a synagogue and he's hearing one elderly gentleman says "oi," and the other one says "oi vey," and the third one says "nu," and he says to them, "Listen, enough talking about your children here in synagogue. Another version of it is enough about politics." But anyway, so there are expressions that only a cry, and then we know today in psychology. And using the Zohar's expression, the Zohar's term, there's a thing called a kola lo yishtama, a voice that cannot be heard. It's brought in context of the shofar sounds. So shofar also has three types of sounds. Tekiya shvarim trua. One is a long blast, one is like short staccato, one is short pauses. And the Talmud talks about them as different types of cries and so on. But there's a kola lo yishtama, which is a voice that has no sound. And not to think of any negatives, but it's the best example. When someone, God forbid, faces a very traumatic experience, the moment that it happens, there's a shock. You can't even cry. Complete shock. As a matter of fact, in the cathartic process of healing, it's very important to allow a person to be in that type of state. And then comes a state where they have to begin to learn to cry, or learn to come to terms with it, and so on. But there's a state where it's complete shock. Not even tears, not even a sound. These are the most intense type of pain. Does not have any sound. And let's talk on the good side. The same thing is on the good side. The deepest moments of joy in a human person's life, as I said, you can express it, you can talk about it, but it's the actual experience has almost no containers at all. So if you really think about it, what's happening here is that the deeper you go inside yourself, the less container, the less you can express it, which of course creates a major paradox. That means as soon as you become aware of it, it's no longer real, as real. Which is really what God told Moses. When Moses says to God, he's on the mountain, and he says to God, at some point when he's praying for forgiveness for the people, and it's a real moment of intimacy. You can see Moses, as the Torah says, that Moses spoke to God like a person speaks to their friend. So it says that Moses says to God, "Show me your face. Hareini na skveidecha. Show me your glory, your honor." And God says the famous immortal words. He says, "Lo yireini adam v'chai." No person can see me and live. And then he continues and says, "But I will show you my back. Upanai lo yiro, but my face you will not see." So this is one of the most mysterious, cryptic verses in the Torah, but it's written for us to know. You'd think, if God is not fulfilling Moses' promise, Moses' request, why tell us this story? We have to know that Moses asked something that God didn't fulfill. And secondly, this is Moses and God. None of us come close to Moses in that context. So what's the relevance of the story to us? And just to amplify the questions here, in general, it says tzaddik geizer HaKadosh Baruch Hu mekayim. When a tzaddik decrees something, God fulfills it. It says also the opposite. When God decrees something, a tzaddik can be mevatel, can abolish it. And Moses is asking God for something. Moses was not a fool. He also understood that you can't see God and live, and yet he asked. That means he meant something about it. What did God really answer him? Something that's so obvious? Then he wouldn't have asked. And why was he rejected? As I said, a tzaddik has effect. So there's a lot of details to the story, but let me just share with you one interpretation from a commentary called the Ponim Yofis. And it's cited in other places as well. He says when you read the verse, and I have one more question before I say that, because that's relevant. When God says to him, "No man can see me and live," okay, that's the answer. Why does he have to rub it in and say again, "I will show you my back"? Okay, so I can't show you my face, but I'll show you my back, at least my back. Which again is metaphor. It's not anthropomorphic. It means you won't see my essence, you'll see a reflection of me. But then why does he rub it in and say, "Upanei lo yiro," but my face you will not see? God said it already. He pointed, to tell him again. So the Ponim Yofis interprets the verses like this, that you're supposed to read it, "V're'isei sacherai upanai." I will show you my back and my face. But my face you can only see by not looking. That's the lo yiro. So there are things we see directly, and there are things we see when we don't look. There are things that we can own and contain because of our logic, through our containers, as I said. But there are things that you can only experience when you let go. True love is that way. True God is that way. This is the ultimate secret of life, and the one that is so disconcerting to so many people, because we live in a world where we've been trained to control everything. You want a loaf of bread, you go to a bakery. You want a relationship, you go to J-Date, or whatever. Does that work? Okay. We learn in a world that if you don't go out and get, if you're not a go-getter, you don't go out and get it, no one's going to do it for you. The problem is you can't apply that principle to anything that's real. You can only apply that principle to material commodities. Material commodities can be acquired. You buy them, you purchase them, you own them. Anything that is real, you cannot own. And as soon as you acknowledge that, your life will change. The problem is we think we want to own it. It really is a sign of deep insecurity, obviously, because you think you have to own it. If you're really secure, who says you have to own everything? Maybe some things that are not, they're not. If you really love somebody, you want to really own them? Yes, we like to know and be controlled, that we don't be surprised, and we're the ones running the show. But true love is part of it is spontaneity, isn't it? Isn't it about things that you can't expect and things that you can't write a script for? But the fear inside of us, so many of us are still children at heart. The fear, we cut that part off. We'd love to have spontaneity, but also with some control. You want to have like both. Planned spontaneity. I'll tell you when you should be spontaneous, okay? Like they say, like from 10 o'clock to 10:15, we're going to have spontaneous dancing, okay? So the point being is that the real things in life, and that's what God was telling Moses. This was not about telling him you're not going to get what you're fulfilled. You will see my face, but you cannot see me as you are. Because if you are who you are, you cannot connect to me in my essence. That's what it means. A human being cannot live. The Jewish philosophers write that if I knew him, I would be him. Anything that is real is the experience itself. Just to make the point, just to drive the point, because it's something that most of us probably do not think about much, because it seems like it's counterintuitive. It's against the way we think. We like to think in terms of understanding things. Here it's like letting go is what allows you to experience it. But the whole concept of consciousness, for example, the idea that we are a subject and there's an object, meaning like if you put your hand near fire, it gets warm. If you put your hand in water, it gets wet. Experiencing things. So there's a subject and there's an object. The subject is the person, the object is the thing, and there's the experience between the subject and object. Real experiences in life is when the subject and object cease to exist and they become one. When we say when you're in the zone, like if you're really immersed in a project that you really love, time will fly by. You won't even realize you're hungry. And then suddenly, at some point, you'll suddenly step back and say, hey, you know something? I'm hungry. The greatest experiences in life is when you lose yourself in the experience, where there's a meltdown between a seamlessness between subject and object, where the experience, it becomes one with you. And that's whether it's an idea that you conceive of, you really get immersed in something. As soon as you become aware that you're thinking, you lose it. So it's about not being aware of it that gives you the real power. And then afterwards, you realize, wow, that was a real aha moment. Wow. I can elaborate further, but I think you can relate to that. And that is the real experiences in life. So they actually do not have real tools. So you could just use tools to get there, but to enter into that place is one that you cannot control it. You have to let go. And that's what God told Moses, and it was a lesson to us as well. You want to see my essence, you want to experience the essence of existence, you cannot come in with your arrogant tools, or even with your presence. You have to let go completely. You let go, it emerges. There are things that emerge, and there are things that can be acquired. True truth emerges, love emerges, God emerges. Anything that's essential emerges. And that is why when you get to the deepest level of things, you cannot find the tools. Can you really see the essence of a human being? You can dress up and look beautiful and project a great image and so on. But can someone really see who you are? Can you even see who you really are? So when we say that God made an appearance, then of course this begs the question, so then what exactly is the role of these senses? And here's where it really gets eloquent. And that is that Judaism's goal is not just that we experience the essence beyond the senses, but that we can come back and tell about it. And that's why, for example, vision and sight does have two dimensions to it. There's one part of sight, as I said earlier, is seeing is believing. When you see something, there's a certain power to it. But let's analyze that for a moment. When let's say, someone you deeply love, and they're traveling, and you haven't seen them in a year, a long time. And then you look forward to the day you will reunite. You can see them, physically see them. What is happening? Why is it such an exciting moment? You love them regardless. They can be a million miles away, and love transcends time and space. You don't need to see someone that you love. What exactly is the power of seeing someone that you truly have a connection with? It's clearly something powerful about it. And it's not superficial. It's not like, hey, because we're such limited mortals that we have to see things. There is something about sight. It's like looking at the face of a child, looking at a exquisite piece of art. And the beauty has an impact on us. So even though, yes, many sights and many of the things we see in the world are very superficial, and it's true that we are seduced and distracted by sights all the time, but that does not mean that sight doesn't have power. And obviously the key is to know what to look at and what not to look at. So what exactly is happening? So one of the answers, one of the explanations given to this is that the essence of God is not defined just by not being able to see it, but ultimately also to be able to see the unseeable. So even though God said to Moses, no man can see me and live, Yureni, but at the same time you read the prophecies about the future, in the Messianic era, you have expressions like ayin ba'ayin yiro, an eye to an eye will see. V'niglik kved Hashem v'ro kol basar yardav. The divine presence will be revealed, and even flesh. It doesn't say the eyes of flesh. Flesh itself will perceive it, see it. So what does that mean? Is that seeing has a power, what's called the power of emes, hisamtus. There's a law, there's a Jewish law that I think is also a law in the Constitution, that ein eid nasa dayan. A witness cannot be a judge. If someone witnessed a crime or witnessed an event, that person cannot sit as a judge. So if a judge actually saw, let's say, a murder, God forbid, or witnessed something else, that judge cannot sit in judgment. That judge can be a witness, but he can't be a judge and a witness. Why? You'd think, hey, that's great. If he saw the thing himself, what does he need? He saw it himself. The answer is because he can't be objective. Because once you see something, there's no way you can be swayed. And the fact is sometimes you can have witnesses that are believable, and maybe they saw, maybe they didn't see it exactly right. Seeing has a power that hearing does not have. Because remember, the same judge is going to listen to a witness, and let's assume the witness is a truthful witness. Why is this witness testifying with words and describing what he saw not as convincing as the judge seeing it himself? Because the fact is, Ein adei mishmiya l'riyah says, sight and sound can be compared to sight. No matter how much you trust somebody, how much they express to you what they saw, an act or a sight of beauty, it doesn't come close to seeing it yourself. So yes, there are people who are artists in communication, who can depict and paint a picture almost as you saw it, but it's still, when you see it, something happens. Because sight has the power of what's called hisamtus, a certain truth and reality to it. So the real soul of sight is that type of power. Now, of course, when it's abused, it has equal power, which is the power of television. I just saw a few weeks ago, I'm sure you all saw that study, the first recommendation from the Academy or whatever of Educational Leaders in America, I don't know what the name of it is, that until 3 years old, or 2.5 years old, 2 years old, children should not be... Huh? What?
No TV whatsoever.
Right. And this is pretty dramatic to say that in the TV age, and that's what they said. Now in Judaism there's no surprise. I think I've shared the story with you. I remember I was once planning a program with my brother. I was sitting in my office discussing things, and he brought his little baby son, his oldest son, who was a little baby crawling around. Now my office happens to be a mecca for children because it's full of paper, so they love it. And this kid made such a mess, all the paper was all over the place. My brother was apologizing to me. I actually found it quite amusing, and it was a good excuse to throw out a lot of garbage. And but I found it good. I always admire, I always love children making a mess. I'd rather have a mess of a children than an order of adults. Let's put it this way, if you know what I mean. So anyway, the child was like, whatever, it's really turning over the whole office while we were talking. And I don't know, by mistake or something, I turned on the TV monitor in our office, and this active child was running around. I think he was maybe, I don't know, a year old, and making such a mess. Suddenly the TV caught his eye, And you had to see this. It was so chilling. I saw a live demonstration of something that I always knew, but as I said, seeing is believing. And the child is sitting there, frozen, no movement, paralyzed, numb, and just staring at the TV. It was so disturbing that my brother says to me, shut it off, shut it off. It's like at 30 seconds probably. And when I shut it off, the kid was still staring at it, because the image is still, and thinking it would come back or whatever it was. And I said to myself, right there, and that became a topic actually that we added to the program. I said to myself, imagine now, this is 30 seconds of exposure. Imagine taking a person, not 30 seconds, but 30 hours. Or what do they say, 5 hours a day. And not one day, day after day and year after year. What does it do to the brain? Now again, the power of sight I just described, the power of sight, seeing something real, creates a reality, but that same seeing can also become something that is like total overexposure, overstimulation, that is like anything in life. Warmth is beautiful, but but heat can destroy. Water is beautiful, but it can flood things. Everything with measure. And I'm thinking that there's no studies made of the psychological damage, where other sites are beginning to control your life. And it's not like a person needs it for their welfare or for their hygiene or for their health. It's essentially easy stimulation, let's be honest. It's the best babysitter, a VCR. Today it's, what do they call it today? A DVD, Blu-ray, whatever.
DVR.
It's a great babysitter precisely because it's so easy. So the power of sight has this double-edged sword. It has the ability to see the deepest things. So it says when God appears to Abraham, it's really saying that Abraham saw God as if you see something with your eyes. We may never know what he actually physically saw. Maybe he saw nothing. But the truth of the experience was as if he saw it. That's the bottom line. Whereas when God spoke, or God hints, or one believes in God and doesn't really see it directly, we all see at times that concept of divine providence, called serendipity, where you see, certain confluence of events come together, you connect the dots. But you cannot say necessarily you see God's face. You can maybe see God's hand. You could see that, hey, how did all that happen? It's not a coincidence. But then when it talks in the Torah about an actual appearance, it means the reality of it is literally as you physically see it. Obviously, these are the things we'd like to see. But unfortunately, our eyes and our sight has been hijacked by others who are imposing sights upon us that seduce us, that hypnotize us, and basically distort our lives. And I'm definitely not from the fire and brimstone to saying, cut out all visuals. But the fact is, visuals can be, as I said, a great, great blessing. When you realize that you want to see the unseeable, when you realize that you want to see someone you love, you want to see love, great. But at the same time, the same sight can become something that is extremely delusional. I'm not even getting into the whole idea that people live their lives vicariously through actors and through shows and so on. Just look at people, I don't know how many, you don't have to raise your hands, soap opera addicts, they live their lives through these people, and they can't miss a show. It's an easy way not to live your own life. You live the life through someone else. And again, the blessings of technology are given. I'm not questioning that at all. But what it does to us is the two things, the double things. It numbs our senses, and above all, it doesn't allow your senses to really go and dig for what they have to dig. Because what you really want to see is the unseeable. And this was the aspiration of Abraham and all the greats throughout history. They wanted to see God. There's actually a story connected to this chapter right here, that when it was the fifth Chabad Rebbe, his name was the Rebbe Rashab. His birthday is this week, the 20th of Cheshvan, which is always around Parsha Vayeira, this week's Parsha. So he was reading the Parsha, and he went in, the story goes, he was a child of 3 or 4 years old. His birthday, so he went into his grandfather, the Tzemach Tzedek, for a birthday blessing, for a bracha, a blessing for his birthday. As soon as he walks in to his grandfather, he starts crying. His grandfather says to him, "Why are you crying?" In Yiddish they spoke. Why are you crying? And the little boy says, because I just read that God appeared to Avram Avinu, to Abraham. And why doesn't he appear to me? That's what he's crying. So the answer that Tzemach Tzedek said to him was, I want to focus on the question more than on the answer, but I'll tell you at the end of the story, that when a Yid, a tzaddik, there's a different version, a Yid at 99 years old decides to circumcise himself, he's worthy that God should appear to him. But the thing that always struck me with the story was, how many people cry because they can't see God? I know people cry for many things. I've seen a few tears in my life. You know, we cry over pain, we cry over broken relationships, we cry over shattered dreams. There's a lot to cry about. But it's usually crying out of deprivation of something that you feel you need. Sometimes it's tears that are necessary and appropriate. Sometimes it's tears that are not necessary. It's just you want things that you don't even need. But here's a young boy, 3-4 years old, of course, who would butzim akat v'yadi, he would become a great Rebbe himself. He cried over the fact that he cannot see God. And what does that mean exactly? It was I think Shlomo Karbach tells the story, but anyway, there was a guest, a visitor came to the shofar, the blowing of shofar, one of the great Rebbes, last generation. And before the blowing of the shofar, this Rebbe started crying. And this guy was a guest, he was as Karbach calls him a yeka, meaning he's very organized, very. And he says to Karbach, he says, why is he crying? He has such a beautiful wife and such beautiful children. Why is he crying? So how do you explain to someone that someone cries during shofar, even though their family is a beautiful family? You see, there's an existential sense. A person who's sensitive, as the Arizal says, that someone who doesn't cry in the 10 days of tshuva, their soul is not complete. There are tears over an incident, over an episode, over a deprivation, as I mentioned. But there are tears sometimes that you just cry middle of nowhere. And those are the healthiest tears because they're coming from a sense of something beyond us that just overwhelms us. When this little child cried that he doesn't see God, it wasn't about he wanted to see some fairy tale guy sitting on a throne in heaven with a long white beard, strikes us with lightning when we misbehave. He was talking about experiencing reality. We see so many things, you want to see something real. And that's what he was crying about. So the idea of aspiring to see, it's not about trying to fit God into our terms, see him on our terms. God appears on a screen or in the shape of something that we can identify with. That is something that's really, it couldn't even be borderline idolatry, because we need a God on our terms. The experience of God is to experience God on God's terms, but to experience it as if you see it with that type of reality. So it is like two opposites. It's connecting to something that transcends sight, sound, and so on, but at the same time, you experience it with that type of reality. It's so real to you, as if something that you can tangibly see right before your eyes. And that's both with sight and the same thing with all our senses. We have these two options all the time. So on a very practical level, it's not so easy to stop the stimulation. Right now you're looking at things, you leave here tonight, you're going to walk down the street, you're going to go home, whatever it is. We're always seeing things, and the sight. And it's like, visuals are constantly entering into our system, willingly, unwillingly, mostly unwillingly, it just enters. But to stop back and think for a moment, here is a man that God appears to, a man that changed history. And maybe it is an opportunity to close your eyes for a moment, which is why in Shema, when we say the Shema, we close our eyes. We cover our eyes. Why do we cover our eyes? Because you want to connect to Hashem Echad, to a unity that is beyond what you see with your eyes. When you look at things, it distracts. When you close your eyes, you have the ability to enter into another space, to travel to another dimension. And when God said to Moses, "No man can see me and live, but you can see me by not looking," I guess when Moses closed his eyes and stopped thinking about seeing God, that's when God emerged. And the same thing is for us. But on a more, let's call it pragmatic level, what we look for is, most of us are looking for love in our lives. Maybe some of you have found it. But even if you found it, there's always new dimensions and so on. And that too, just like truth and just like God, requires an emergence, not an acquisition. You can do things that allow something to emerge. And the first step you have to know is how to let go. That's why the exercise of closing your eyes, your ears, your taste, touch, and smell, to shut down that outer stimulation, is the first step to let something emerge. Shabbos is essentially this message. Try to minimize as much material involvement and creating outer stimulation as possible, and then things emerge. Unfortunately, most of us only know about what you shouldn't do on Shabbos, don't realize what one should do, which is experience a more sublime dimension in things. But to see the sublime, you have to get rid of the things, the gross forces that block out the sublime. Think of it this way. The Zohar says every one of us has a very melody inside our soul. A very subtle, kol d'mama daka, a very subtle, gentle voice. The problem is, you can't hear it. And others can't. You know why? Because there's a lot of extraterrestrial noise. When you have a rush hour, when you have a lot of street noises, you don't hear subtle sounds. So music can be playing right now, but there's so much going on, there's such a rush of activity going on in your brain, you can't hear it. When a person would go see a Rebbe, a tzaddik, or would enter in a space that I said is more sublime, what's really happening is they go into a place where there's the turbulence and all the resistance is minimized, so then something emerges. Emerges is the word. It's not someone's going to give you your song. Your song is playing right now, but you can't hear it because your mind and your heart is racing with activity, even if you're not conscious of it constantly. That's why I always suggest that in the morning when you wake up, you say Moda'ani. Before you go to sleep, don't fall asleep with the television on or a newspaper on your nose, because then the sleep hours, if you enter the night with a prayer, Biyotcha afkidruchi, to you I entrust, in your hands I trust my spirit. Or you enter into a moment that with getting less of the clutter, things emerge. And that is something we all have the power to do. So the basic suggestion then is stop minimizing clutter. But you have to be specific. You have to find things that find time out where you cut out certain things that simply overwhelm and don't allow your own voice, your own song to emerge. You start doing it, you'll be surprised what kind of voices will emerge from within you. So we read Vayeira of Hashem, that God appears to him. It really means we all have an Abraham within us. And Mosai Yegia Maisi De Avoisai, the Medrash says that one should always ask, when will we achieve and reach the level of the patriarchs? So we have the ability to, in a subtle way, to also have a divine appearance. But you have to probably shed a tear or two, like the Rebbe Rashab did. And above all, you have to shed, not just a tear, shed some of the layers, some of the other stimulation that doesn't let this emerge. And when you do, God emerges. That's what Abraham ultimately discovered, that you cannot find God. God has to find you. But like the Kotzker Rebbe said, where's God? They asked him. He said, wherever you let him in. How do you let him in? You let him in by getting rid of some of the superfluous and extra baggage that clutters our lives. So, I wish you all a week where you can unclutter a bit. And even if you can't, tafasta merubah tafasta, to bite off more than you can chew is not necessarily the approach. What you do is you begin small. You find moments of study, of prayer, of charity, in the morning when you wake up, or other moments where you can say, this is total focus. I will not pick up the phone, won't pick up messages. This is a time where you shut down. And when you do, what happens is you enter into another space and you can connect it. And the ultimate is, of course, you connect it, like I said, with the subject and object, melt into one seamless flow, one seamless experience. So that's something to think about when our sights, the power of sight, the reality of sight and the distortions of sight. the delusion of sight. And it's in your control. You choose where you look, you choose how to use your eyes, what to look at, and what you want to look at, and what you're aspiring to look at. It was Nixon that said, before he resigned, and he looked at the big painting of JFK. So Kissinger writes, I think in his memoirs, he says that Nixon said to the painting, JFK said, they love you because you remind them of who they want to be. And they hate me because I remind them of who they are. Or, if you want to put another way of putting it, the Alter Rebbe once said a different type of expression. I'm not going to compare him to Nixon, but he said that Judaism, or Hasidus, teaches you how small you are and how great you can become. Or another expression related to it is how great the small things are and how small the great things are. Which means that there's really two things you want to be able to see how you are, what you're capable of being. Often because life beats us up, and we have good friends that always remind us of how unaccomplished we are, and how we shouldn't get our hopes up. We lose sight of, and emphasis on the word sight, of our true personalities. So looking for who you can be, who you really can be, instead of who you are, or what other people think you are, or what other people will expect of you. Live your life, not someone else's, is also part of the aspiration of Vayeira, of appearance. And that's why we're told the story. We're not just told that God appeared to Abraham 3,800 years ago, whatever, around that time, but that God appears to each of us. And you have the power, especially this week, to experience that appearance, that vision. So may our visions be healthy, and not only healthy, but great, magnificent, majestic visions. And may we cut out some of the sights that just distract or do worse to our psyche. We should have a very, very pleasant week. I want to announce a few things. Number one is that Philip will be giving his class tomorrow night, as he usually does, 7 o'clock. It's Philip Namaworth, for those of very interesting class. He's a colleague student of mine for many years. He's one of the original, from back in 1985, I believe, is when he began. And I also want to mention that if you haven't left your email address with us, please do so we can stay in touch. And I again apologize to some people who were viewing this. We're in the middle of upgrading our systems now, video systems, and hopefully in the next few weeks be able to have a very seamless and painless experience in viewing these classes. And more to be announced as we go along. And as always, it's a great honor to be able to share a few words with you and intersect in our spiritual journeys of our lives. And I hope to see you again. You're always welcome, all of you, to be here. And please stay in touch. And if you'll see me, the Meaningful Life Center, as a resource, an asset, ally to you and to your life's aspirations. Thank you very much.